Beneath the forgotten soil of America, there are stories that were never meant to be unearthed, stories that lived behind closed doors, in whispers no one dared to repeat, in photographs tucked away and burned before the light of day could expose them. Tonight, we step into one of those stories, a family whose very existence was twisted by bloodlines that folded in on themselves. Their tragedy was not just in what they endured, but in what they became. Theirs is not the tale of monsters hiding in shadows. It is the tale of what happens when isolation, secrecy, and desperation corrode the walls of a home, until that home itself becomes a prison. In a remote corner of the country, far removed from the gaze of neighbors, there lived a family whose name rarely crossed lips, yet whose faces linger in memory like ghosts. When strangers stumbled upon them, it wasn't just deformities they noticed. It was the silence, the way words faltered on tongues that had forgotten how to form sentences, the way eyes didn't meet yours but drifted in directions you couldn't follow. Generations of shared blood had left its mark, not only in the way they looked, but in the very way they existed. But let us not mistake this as a tale of cruelty directed outward. No, their pain was not born from violence against others, but from the suffocating embrace of their own lineage. They were bound by traditions that had ceased to be traditions, bound by secrecy that turned into a curse. Some of them didn't even understand that the world outside lived differently. For them, their lives, however fractured, however misshapen, were simply life as it had always been. It is easy for us to look from the outside and recoil, to judge, to whisper words like grotesque or monstrous, but the truth is far more disturbing. The truth is that this family was human as you or I, and that is why their story unsettles us. Because once you strip away the layers of rumor, of gossip, of the sensational headlines, you are left with a tragedy that reflects something buried deep within the human condition. The desire to belong, the fear of being cast out, and the terrible things we do when all we have is each other. Tonight, we open a door that has long remained shut, and once you step through, you may find yourself wishing you never had. The roots of this tragedy stretch back further than most dare to trace. Long before the family became the subject of whispers and morbid fascination, they were simply settlers. Poor, isolated, forgotten by progress, and left to make do with what little the land provided. Their homes were not built for comfort, but for survival, and survival meant clinging tightly to whoever remained within reach. In towns where families thrived on connections, marriages arranged, alliances forged, this family found themselves increasingly cut off, both geographically and socially. What began as necessity slowly hardened into tradition. It started with cousins, a bond of kinship that blurred into something else when no outsiders came near. Then cousins gave way to brothers and sisters, mothers and sons, fathers and daughters. The bloodline tightened, looping in on itself, growing weaker with every passing generation. To outsiders, the deformities that began to appear were shocking. Crossed eyes that never aligned, jaws that seemed frozen half-formed, bodies that didn't quite fit the mold of what a body should be. But to the family, this was the face of normalcy. The children born into it did not know any different. Their reflections were not grotesque to them, they were simply familiar. Yet behind these features was more than just the stamp of shared blood. There was the silence. Many in the family could barely speak, and those who did formed words that tumbled out jagged, broken, as if language itself had begun to unravel within their lineage. The world beyond their fences was alien to them, its rules foreign, its judgments crushing. The family learned to retreat, to pull further inward, as though they knew instinctively that exposure meant shame. But shame was already alive within their walls. Mothers who bore children that did not survive, fathers who grew quiet in the face of deformities they could not explain, children who looked to their parents with questions that could not be answered. This silence, this self-contained world, was its own form of haunting. You see, it wasn't only their bodies that bore the scars of isolation, it was their souls. And perhaps that is what makes this story more than just a spectacle. It is not just about what the eye can see, but about what the heart feels when all roads lead back into the same dark room. The tragedy was not sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible. A decline passed hand to hand like an heirloom no one wanted, but no one could let go. By the time the 20th century cast its long shadow over America, the family had become more myth than reality to those who lived nearby. Outsiders spoke of them in hushed tones, warning children not to wander too close to the broken house at the edge of the woods. Yet those who dared approach often returned pale, shaken, muttering that something wasn't right inside those walls. And they were correct, because what they saw was not simply poverty nor eccentricity, but the visible result of generations sealed off from the world. Visitors described figures with faces that seemed to collapse inward, as if time itself had worn them down. Eyes that drifted apart, gazes that could never quite find focus, voices that came out as grunts, squeaks, or fragmented syllables that bore only the faintest resemblance to language. To hear them speak was to feel language itself disintegrating. To watch them walk was to see bodies struggling against the very shape they had inherited. But the true horror wasn't in these features. It was in the atmosphere. A house that felt more like a tomb than a home. Rooms where children sat in silence, rocking back and forth, eyes wide but empty, as though they were looking into a world none of us could see. Adults who stood in doorways, their expressions unreadable, not with hostility, but with a kind of vacant endurance. Theirs was not a home of laughter, nor conversation, nor warmth. It was a place where time moved differently, where each day was only endured until the next. And yet, even here, there was love. Twisted, complicated, desperate love. A mother still cradled her son, humming broken tunes into his ear, even if the boy could not understand the words. A brother still placed food into the hands of his sister, even if she could not meet his gaze. The family cared for each other in ways that outsiders would never comprehend. Their bond was their strength, even as it became their curse. Still, the world beyond would not stay silent forever. Rumors grew into stories, stories into legends, until the family was no longer simply forgotten. They were feared. And once fear takes root, it never stays contained. Outsiders would soon force their way into this hidden world, and when they did, the family's fragile silence would finally break. It was a sheriff who first brought their world crashing into the light. The year was unremarkable, a small rural county where law and order mostly meant chasing away drifters or breaking up drunken fights. But when whispers of the family grew louder, children too strange to be explained, screams heard on nights with no moon, the sheriff decided to see for himself. What he found would become a stain on the town's memory, one they never managed to scrub away. The reports describe his steps into that broken house, though even the reports feel hesitant, as if the writer wished the ink could erase itself. He found them huddled together in a dim room, their faces illuminated only by the flicker of a kerosene lamp. The silence was suffocating. When he spoke, there was no answer, only the faint sound of breath, and an occasional sound that didn't quite resemble words, but wasn't entirely animal either. He wrote of bodies that seemed both familiar and alien, as though human form had been rewritten, the lines blurred, the details distorted. The sheriff didn't stay long. He didn't have to. What he saw was enough to unsettle even the hardest man. His presence rippled through the county, and soon others came. Journalists, social workers, men with cameras. For the first time, the family's silence was invaded by voices that did not belong, voices that asked questions they could not answer. Their faces, once hidden in shadow, were caught on film. Their deformities, once confined to rumor, were now plastered in print for strangers to gawk at. The family, who had known only each other, suddenly became a spectacle. They were no longer people in the eyes of outsiders, but curiosities. Their photographs were passed around like carnival exhibits. Strangers came from miles away, not to help, but to stare. And in this cruel act of exposure, the family's humanity was stripped bare. They became, known not as individuals, but as the Inbreds, a name that followed them like a curse. What outsiders never understood was that this wasn't a story of choice. It wasn't as if this family had chosen their path. It was the result of isolation, of poverty, of being abandoned by the progress that others enjoyed. They didn't know better because they had never been shown better, and that may be the most unsettling truth of all, that their tragedy was not born of malice but of neglect. The flood of attention did not bring salvation, it brought collapse. Once their faces were etched into newspapers and whispered across county lines, the family could no longer retreat into silence. Children mocked them from afar, throwing stones at their home. Men drove out late at night, honking horns, laughing, daring one another to get close enough to glimpse the freaks. What had once been a quiet, hidden suffering was now a public humiliation. And in the cruelest twist, the family had no way to understand why the world suddenly hated them. Some of the younger ones recoiled from any outsider who approached, trembling as though touch itself might burn them. Others grew violent, lashing out with sounds instead of words, unable to express the fury swelling inside them. Mothers hid their children from view, clutching them tighter, humming broken songs in an effort to drown out the jeers from beyond their door. But the damage was already done. Once a family becomes a story, they no longer belong to themselves. They belong to the crowd. And yet, if you strip away the cruelty of outsiders, you find the core of their tragedy still beating. Imagine being born into a world where your bloodline is the only reality. Imagine never hearing the clear voices of neighbors, never being taught the rhythms of conversation, never knowing that life could be larger than 4 rotting walls and a handful of faces that all resemble your own. Their lives were not only marked by deformity, they were marked by absence, an absence of knowledge, of opportunity, of choice. By the time social workers and doctors tried to intervene, it was already too late. Generations of isolation had carved deep scars, physical and psychological, that could not simply be undone. Reports described them as beyond repair. But what those reports often lacked was compassion. To see them as broken meant ignoring truth. They had been broken by circumstances, by neglect, by the failure of a society that chose to look away until it was too late. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away, or would you have stayed, even knowing that staying meant being swallowed by the same darkness? In the years that followed, the family faded into something even stranger than myth. They became a cautionary tale. Parents invoked their name to frighten children into obedience, whispering that if they didn't behave, they'd end up like them. Writers used their story as shorthand for degeneracy, stripping away their humanity until they were little more than a grotesque metaphor. And yet, beneath the cruelty of gossip and legend, they remained flesh and blood. They still woke each morning, they still ate meals together, they still clung to one another because there was no one else to cling to. Some members drifted into institutions, locked away under the guise of care, though care often meant neglect of another kind. There, among peeling walls and endless corridors, they were studied like specimens. Doctors recorded the shapes of their skulls, the patterns of their speech, the angles of their limbs, as though these bodies were curiosities, not human beings with fears and memories. Their photographs sat in folders, labeled and catalogued, another set of artifacts in the archive of America's forgotten poor. Those who remained behind in the decaying house lived quieter, even more withdrawn lives. The laughter of intruding teenagers grew less frequent. The visits from curious reporters faded, but the damage lingered. Their reputation had become their prison. No matter where they went, no matter how they tried to exist beyond their land, they were marked. The word inbred hung over them like a noose. And so they remained, generation by generation, ghosts in their own lifetimes. What unsettles us most even now is that their story isn't entirely unique. Across the forgotten landscapes of America, other families faced similar fates, poverty, isolation, and shame intertwining until bloodlines blurred. But this family became the most infamous, because once the world glimpsed them, it could not look away. And perhaps deep down, people weren't horrified by the family themselves. They were horrified by what the family revealed. That civilization is fragile, that without connection, without community, any of us could be reduced to the same silence, the same endless echo of our own bloodline. And so the story comes to its final chapter, though in truth it never truly ends. The house where they once lived has mostly rotted away, swallowed by weeds and silence. Only fragments remain: rusted bed frames, broken windows, scraps of clothing buried in the soil. To most who pass by, it is just another ruin in a forgotten town. But for those who know, the ground itself feels heavy, as if it remembers. The family's name is spoken less and less, as if silence could erase the discomfort their memory brings. Yet photographs still surface, grainy and unsettling, faces frozen in time, eyes that never quite align. And when people see those images, their first reaction is often laughter or horror. Rarely compassion, rarely recognition that these were lives lived in full, however fractured, however tragic. The world prefers to keep them as symbols of something grotesque rather than acknowledge them as human beings who suffered. But if you look closely, past the deformities, past the silence, you might glimpse something deeper. A child holding her brother's hand. A mother shielding her son from the gaze of strangers. Small gestures of tenderness, flickers of humanity that even the heaviest curses could not erase. These details remind us that their story is not about monstrosity. It is about survival in the absence of choice. It is about what happens when a family is abandoned by the world and left to collapse inward. Their tragedy endures not because of what they were, but because of what they reveal about us. The ease with which we turn suffering into spectacle, the swiftness with which we label, mock and dismiss those whose lives do not fit our narrow vision of normal. In the end, the family was destroyed less by their own bloodline than by the cruelty of the gaze that fell upon them, and perhaps that is the haunting truth we are left with. They were not monsters. They were not myths. They were us, reduced, stripped of connection, trapped in silence. And their memory lingers as a warning, buried beneath the soil of America, whispering to anyone willing to listen. What we fear in them is only a reflection of what we could become if the world ever turned its back on us.